When it comes to web applications, you've got the client side of things, you've got the server side of things, and where is the heavy lifting happening can actually become a vulnerability. Join us for Cast Plus and this episode as we talk about those vulnerabilities.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to IT Pro TV. I am Chris Ward, joined by, of course, Adam Gordon, our illustrious leader in this journey through Cast Plus, preparing you for the CAS 004 exam. And as we said, to kind of tease this off, we're continuing a little bit of a discussion about our web applications, but kind of moving over into more of the system side of things. And to kind of kick us off, let's talk a little bit, Adam, and find out about what do we need to know about these web application components from a client side, maybe versus a server side.
So absolutely, good place to jump in. So when we think about web application components, right, how, and the theme generally, right, is let's understand vulnerabilities. And we've made it clear, if you haven't seen our first episode in this topic block, definitely go back and take a look. We made it clear, Chris and I, that this is really about web applications and the vulnerabilities that attach to them across a variety of different perspectives. As we talk about in this episode, vulnerable systems. Next episode, we'll talk about some tools, right, that may be valuable in attacks that may we may have to use those tools around in order to prevent these things from unfolding. But we want to be thinking here about client-side versus server-side processing. This is a good place for us to begin this conversation because there really are only two ways we can do this, right? If we're serving up web content, we can do it at the client side in the browser directly, and the processing and the manipulation of information can occur there, or it can occur on the server side, where we essentially form everything, get it all set up, have it ready to go, and just provide it as a fully finished and therefore viable solution to you, which you then see and consume in your browser, but there's no processing and no opportunity for you to interact and perhaps a bad actor to get in the way of that process if it's happening on the server side, because it's heavily defended and protected, at least it should be anyway. Whereas if it's happening on the client side, well, bad things may occur. There may be malware, there could be buffer overflows, there could be all sorts of things that the bad actor can execute directly on the client endpoint. We may or may not have visibility into them. We certainly may not be able to defend against them. So join me here. This whole conversation comes down to, hey, where do we actually run the application code and how do we process it, especially when it comes to things like scripts that are automated and can inject all sorts of additional content by calling files, calling processes, and doing any number of things, all of which may be legitimate, by the way, but a lot of which can be suspect if they're happening without our knowledge. The bottom line here for the exam, client side bad, server side good, because if we're doing it at the server side, as I suggested, we are less likely to have bad actors able to access and interact with that process. If it's on the client side, well, we don't really know, right, what's happening, and it's pretty obvious that because of the issues associated with endpoint concerns, right, malware and things that we've already been talking about where we can lead to buffer overflow and potentially the box being compromised, we know for a fact that this is a viable attack vector and one we want to avoid. So let's make sure we're clear on that. Client side bad, server side good, real simple for purposes of the exam. But we also want to be thinking about different ways in which we can approach the exchange of data. JSON and REST come to mind here. Representational state transfer is what REST stands for, or RESTful APIs, right? And JSON, JavaScript object notation. This is the data exchange format that's used to send and receive data to and from APIs. And APIs based on REST or RESTful architectural styles are going to be all of the majority of the APIs that we use today in web services. And so when we combine these together and we use JSON RESTful APIs to exchange data in and among web technologies and applications, we have to worry about things like injection attacks and susceptibility to them. The concept here is that the bad actor can potentially insert specific syntax and keywords and or manipulate existing syntax and keywords in the exchange based on knowing the way in which JSON and RESTful API structure is going to be managed. And if they're able to do that, they may be able to change the underlying operation of that application, manipulating and exposing data, allowing certain things to happen that are normally not supposed to, or engaging in access to information that normally should not be available, especially in an unsecured and in this case, cryptographically protected way, meaning we're likely to expose data that we normally are not able to see. How do we protect against this? APIs should carefully inspect and sanitize all input and output streams. We keep coming back to these themes. Let's know what we're doing. Let's know where it's coming from. Let's understand the genesis, right? The way in which that information has come about. And if we're suspect in any way, shape, or form, we're just not comfortable with where that stuff is coming from and what it looks like is not what we expect, we should just say no. It's better to deny a transaction and have to then worry about getting the right user into the right information and apologizing than it is to allow suspect transactions to go forward, hoping that we're not going to get into trouble. A tool that may be valuable here, the OWASP JSON sanitizer. Notice the GitHub repo, that the repo URL there. This is a legitimate URL, unlike the ones we showed you in the prior episode that were used just for demonstration purposes. So please be aware of that. But how do you approach this on the exam? Hey, understand the logic of the technology, a little bit about the potential exposures and concerns, and then what is the protective measure or approach that we should use? Combine that with knowledge of a specific tool in this case, and you're off to the races and are good if you're asked about this particular issue. Let's check in with Chris real quick. We're just beginning this conversation. We have a few more things to discuss. But Chris, so far we talked about client-side, server-side. We've talked a bit about JSON and REST and how to protect potentially by vetting our input. All good so far, or maybe some things that we want to consider before we move on?
Well, I think you really touched on something that's always been important, whether you and Mike have discussed this, you and I have discussed this, and we will continue to discuss this, and that is, what are we looking for that CAS 004 exam? And what Adam has done here is broken it down into, here are the important points. Make sure you know the definitions, recognize what is being used to do what. And so that way, if you know those things, it's a lot easier to pick out of a lineup exactly, where are they trying to go with that. So as we continue on, though, Adam, and taking a look at our web application components, what about communication that happens? I'm thinking especially when we start talking about things like XML and working with HTTP. What are some things we need to know about that?
So there's a lot of stuff, right, potentially that falls into that bucket, but probably high level. We want to focus on first is, and you said it, communication. We want to focus on protocols and languages. And you mentioned HTTP. We'll throw in HTTPS there because we know we want to try to be secure. But whether it is HTTP with XML, so XML, extensible markup language, and the use of communication protocols like SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol, we want to be able to understand the logic of the protocols. Protocols are languages that are used to be able to allow us to exchange information in predefined formats. Agreeing on a language implies we're agreeing on a method of communication, and the expectations that go with that are important for us to be aware of, to document, but also then to manage against and hold ourselves and our vendors, the people we're interacting with, to consume information, accountable for. Join me here, if you will. SOAP is at the top of that list, as I mentioned. Simple Object Access Protocol, probably one you've heard about, maybe even one you have some passing knowledge of, but I'm willing to bet one you may not know as much about as you would like. It is a protocol designed to allow for communication over, as I mentioned, HTTP using XML, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or Transport Protocol. You hear people refer to it differently, using XML, the extensible markup language. And as a result of that, the ability for us to use XML and to guarantee and provide guidance around, and therefore conformity with the structure of XML as it's implemented by SOAP, that is defined through what we call a WSDL, or Web Services Description Language document. Think of it as the formatting document, the document that tells us what we can do, under what conditions, and how it should look. This document can be queried directly and essentially shows up like a web page, gives us detailing information, tells us about the parameters, the data types, how the API, in other words, should potentially consume and interact this information. That's all good, but here's the problem. We can exploit that definition detail and that document and manipulate it. Anything that's written down that is going to say, do this way, and then this will happen. Well, good to know, so we could follow the rules, right? But bad actors find that stuff out. Hey, they want to play too. And if they can get in there and they can exploit that knowledge, and or manipulate those transactions. They could do things like injection attacks. And there's a variety of different injection attacks. SQL, structured query language injections, are always at the top or near the top of that list. We'll talk more about injection attacks coming up, but they can engage in the presentation of information that is designed specifically to provide access to information for unauthorized users. And they may be able to go in and look for content that is hidden or obscured in multiple ways. They may even be able to authenticate, bypass the system, meaning they can essentially walk right in the front door and not have to show credentials that authorize them to be there. Because if they can push the right kind of SQL query through the front door of that system, the front door is the web page where the API is going to be posting information, usually a form that allows us to provide information, invites us to authenticate and log in. Hey, who are you? Type in your username and password, right? Well, that information is going to go back to the web server, and through the web server be assessed against the database of known users in one or more tables maintained on that database. If I can push the appropriate query, the structured query language, SQL query, through that front end form, because those form fields, username and password, are alphanumeric. They have to allow both letters and numbers and maybe even special characters, in the case of passwords in particular, to be provided so that we can actually provide our password, right? Our username, most likely, more often than not, just going to be alpha and numeric. We probably don't use special characters. But if the system is not designed to check that input, to validate, as you've heard Chris and I say several times, what that input is, well, guess what? I can push all sorts of stuff through that seemingly small little window, that little rectangle that says, hey, what's your username? I may be able to put thousands of characters in there. If we haven't provided a value that says maximum character count for everybody's username is no more than 20, so I'm going to allow 20 characters. Well, if I allow 200, 255, maybe 300, I can actually write a query string, dump it into that form field, hit enter. That information goes to the server. SOAP is going to process it. WSDL is going to structure it and tell us what it should look like. And if I can manipulate that and get the system on the back end to examine that SQL query and execute it, or potentially try to, because we allow dynamic queries as opposed to only accepting static queries that are not offered by users in web pages anonymously, but are hard-coded in the system. If I do that, guess what? I've injected and I've overcome that system, and I'm probably looking at the entire user database. I've dumped that user table. I may even be authenticated through authentication bypass as the administrator of that system. Because guess what? The user administrator, or the administrative user, is usually the first user at the top of that user table. And with a bypass attack, I actually will typically get authenticated as the first user. Doesn't always work that way, but more often than not, the odds are in our favor. How do you protect against all this kind of stuff? Well, lots of good guidance out there from OWASP. Got a couple of URLs for you there. They are both legitimate, by the way, so please do make sure you take a look at them. Not suggesting that you have to look at this guidance and read it thoroughly to take and pass the exam, but I am suggesting that you're very likely to be asked about elements in this guidance to make sure you understand how to do what I just described and minimize or mitigate this attack, and it's going to be important for you to be thinking along those lines. In addition, want to be thinking about what happens in the browser, right? We've been talking about the server side for a while. We said server side good, client side bad to start this conversation off. Well, browsers run on the client, and we're not saying everything on the client is bad. What we are saying is we don't want actual processing and script access and script execution happening on the client side. That is what's bad. But the browser provides our gateway and is the application that provides and manages the experience we have interacting with web-based APIs and services, and provides and structures the environment that we do so with. Now, regardless of what browser you use, whether you're a Chrome fan, whether you're an Edge fan, whether you like Safari, Brave, Firefox, doesn't matter. All of them support the use of extensions and plugins. And these are seemingly on the surface, when you talk to most people, identical. People say, oh yeah, it's just all that stuff we put in the browser that just adds a bunch of stuff in that isn't there. Well, yes and no. There's a distinct difference here. You need to know this difference for the exam. Extensions are added to a web browser, but they purposefully and specifically are designed to expand functionality and or add features, while plugins are basically going to do that as well. But the difference is that the extension, the way it's loaded, the way it's going to be provided, is not accessible by the browser. And as a result, when I say not accessible by the browser, what I mean is that it is not going to be something that the actual browser is going to interact with directly and is going to allow code to be executed through or manipulated via. And as a result of that, it is going to give us added functionality and features, but it's not being added in such a way that it becomes a security liability, right? And so this is very important. Whereas browser plugins, they're installed in a way that allows them to be called or executed by website code, meaning an external party can interact with that plugin and call it in such a way that it can be manipulated. This opens up a whole bunch of problems for us. And this is the reason we say client-side execution bad, server-side execution good. Because if we allow browser plugins, and you see the list of some obvious candidates there, hopefully the warning signs are already starting to flash and go off. Anytime you mention the word Adobe and Flash in the sentence along with, hey, what am I doing wrong with web security? That is going to be the right answer, because we know historically that is really an insecure solution. That's why it's no longer supported. And we know, given the amount of problems it caused, that it was because websites could access that plugin and actually execute through it, and all sorts of malware and bad things was pushed down, and the systems were compromised. Microsoft ActiveX and Oracle Java are all examples of this, right? So please keep that in mind. The difference here, extensions good, plugins bad. So Chris, let's check in real quick, see what you think about my extensions and plugins conversation. A lot of good, bad, right, kind of discussions going on. But it is important to know unequivocally, right, what we should or should not be doing.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, you made mention of the fact that as soon as someone hears the words of Flash or Java and all of those things that, obviously were, put in to help people have better experiences in their web applications, but instead have actually turned into these things that literally cause security holes all over the place. And that's why, we don't see Flash around anymore. But we have just a few more things, though, to talk about here when we start getting into these web application components and things like that, including things like difference between bytecode, machine code, and, even HTML5, right?
Oh, we do. There's definitely some additional things, right? We probably want to at least mention in passing. You did mention the majority of them right there. But let's jump back and let's talk about bytecode and machine code. You mentioned that. Certainly worth a moment of our time. Again, I find people are often not really, let's just say, aware of and probably focused on some of these things because they're so low level, meaning they just happen in the background of our systems. We don't really take them for granted. We just don't really think about them at all because everything seems to work. I mean, who sits down and says, I wonder what kind of bytecode and machine code is running in my system today? I should probably go check that out, right? People just don't think about that. A, because it's inaccessible to us as humans. B, because, well, let's be honest, if you're not a programmer working with this kind of functionality, you don't consider this. You just open an app, and if it works, great. And if it doesn't, well, you try to figure out what may be wrong and hopefully get it working. But bytecode is the intermediary state of what we call source code. This is going to be designed to be processed by an interpreter on the target system. The interpreter is a program that will translate bytecode into machine code. So it's good to know that bytecode is going to be earlier in that cycle of how we consume and understand code and create functionality through execution. Bytecode is interpreted, translated into the appropriate machine code for that particular system, combination of hardware and software that forms that system and is operating. And that is then able to be processed or in a language that is understood and therefore operational to the CPU. So bytecode is the lowest level that we often will think about of code existing, but it's not the level that code is understood by a device. It's simply the level that it exists at as we translate it up into machine code. Machine code is that lowest level of code that is actually understood by devices because it is interpreted, translated into the specific language that machine will speak, and then made available for execution. So just want to make sure we understand the concepts from a vocabulary perspective, just like browser extensions and plugins, right? Just understand the logic of how they interact and or perhaps relate to one another. as you're preparing for the exam. Good use of flashcards here, by the way, probably to keep track of all this stuff. Also want to be thinking, going back to the well for some more language conversations like we just had with SOAP and with JSON and REST. Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. We've already defined XML, remember, as extensible markup language. It's commonly referred to as AJAX, an acronym you probably have heard, but may not actually understand or know much about. Talk to most people, they don't realize it is about JavaScript and XML and the way in which those two things are working together. But it is more secure than most other methods that allow us to interact and move information between the client and the server. The interactions are going to be forced to be done through server-side scripts. And as a result of that, as we said, server-side good, client-side bad. So that part is good. We like that. It is considered more secure as a result. So we want to make sure we're aware of that. But like all approaches, right, there are some concerns here. We do have reliance on underlying web technologies. And as a result of that, while AJAX itself may be more secure because it forces and prefers and prioritizes execution on the server side, so we could check that box off. The problem is, of course, the underlying other technologies may not be secure. And so we are often susceptible to the same vulnerabilities that plague all other methods of communication. Are we encrypting? Are we sending in the clear? As I said, we transmit using commands, or rather transmit certain commands in plain text. And as a result of that, that can expose all sorts of data. And that is a significant liability. So we want to make sure we know that the preferencing in AJAX for server-side execution is a step in the right direction, but the clear communication or sending of information in the clear can actually be used to aggregate and infer information, which can then be used to compromise that system and many others. So that's an issue. A lot of guidance on this can be found, again, at the URL listed here. It is a valid URL. Please think about using it. The cheat sheet series in general from OWASP, you've seen me reference in several of the screens that have come up in our conversation. A very great series, good amount of material there. It's good in the real world as well as for purposes of exam preparation. OWASP does a great job. The community does of updating and maintaining that information. So I want to be aware of that. But also keep in mind the URLs may change over time. Just because they're working right now as we shoot the episode doesn't mean 6 months, a year down the road when that episode is finally watched by you, that URL may not have changed for some reason. So always keep that in mind. Try to use the URL if it's not the one that we have on the screen or in the episode notes. Do let us know that. We certainly will try to keep on top of it and update them. But sometimes they get away from us, but use common sense. Go out and Google for it. You can probably find the most up-to-date version, and that's what you should be using anyway to study for and prepare for the exam. And we break these out into our episode notes so you can have access to them, make sure you can take advantage of it. And Chris, you did mention, if I'm not mistaken, HTML5. So let's make sure we end on a high note here. HTML, hypertext markup language. Want to make sure we're thinking about most current version, V5 or version 5. There's a lot of stuff that goes on here. Again, a cheat sheet URL there for good guidance on how to secure HTML5. But in general, HTML has been around, well, forever and a day. And there's a lot of good there, but there's also a lot of things that continue to be problematic. Want to make sure we're focusing on things like cross-origin resource sharing, things like making sure we're looking at how execution takes place, client-side versus server-side, geolocation requests. There's a lot of stuff on the screen, and we want to make sure we're thinking that these are issues we want to at least be aware of. And again, the guidance on this from OWASP would go a long way towards helping us to understand the do's and don'ts here.
All right, great stuff, Adam. Thanks so much for another incredible episode here of CAS Plus. Don't forget, as we looked at today, we have the server side of things. We have the client side of things. We took a look at some protocols and everything from SOAP to JSON and REST and HTML5 ending up. Make sure you check out the downloadables and put together maybe some flashcards and learn and understand these concepts. That way you will be able to reproduce them when you're sitting in that small waylet room after spending a large amount of money to answer questions on a computer screen. We got more exciting episodes coming up here for CAS Plus. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.
Here in CAS Plus, in previous episodes, we've talked about some of the vulnerabilities that can occur in our web applications. And in today's episode, we're going to take a look at when these attacks occur. What do they look like? Join us.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to IT Pro TV. I'm Chris Ward, joined by, of course, Adam Gordon, and you are watching CAS Plus, our journey to prepare you for the CAS 004 exam. And I got to tell you something, the episodes, they keep getting better and better, Adam. We've been talking about web application vulnerabilities and all kinds of cool things. And we have, of course, PKI and system engineering and a whole bunch more to come up. But today's episode, we want to talk a little bit about what we need to know about web application attacks. When people, not just you have this vulnerability, now that somebody is actually knocking on the door, they are attacking.
Yes, I was going to make a knocking sound, but I couldn't think of a good way to do that without being obtrusive and obvious. So absolutely, when a bad actor is outside of our systems, right, looking to gain access and getting, and we've been talking, Chris and I, across many episodes, and Mike and I for that matter as well, right, around different ways. We call them attack vectors, vulnerabilities, weaknesses, all sorts of things that bad actors who are paying attention can actually leverage and utilize to gain entry into our systems and, of course, wreak havoc. And all sorts of bad outcomes come from that activity. When we think about what we want to know about web applications and attacks against them, we're being very specific and we're really scoping and narrowing our discussion so that we can be granular in a specific area. And to that end, there are definitely attacks that we want to take note of. Join me here, if you will. We'll begin our journey by talking about directory traversal, also commonly referred to as file path traversal or just simply file path attacks. The idea here is that our web servers serving up our content are going to have structure, hierarchy, file systems, and as a result of that, information stored within them, just like every endpoint that runs an operating system does. And if the bad actor is able to figure out what kind of operating system we are running, hence the reference right here to Linux and Windows, and the traditional path that is associated with storing World Wide Web or www content in each of those OSs, var www versus CINET pub www root. The idea there is bad actors know this. This is not a secret. Anybody who hosts any kind of content on a Linux or Windows box and installs a web server will know where that content lives by default. And if we know that that stuff is there, and then the subdirectories below, www root or www will then be the directories where all the content lives, well, we're able to literally walk those directories. That's the directory traversal or file path traversal approach. We allow attackers potentially to access that information because they're able to use what is also commonly referred to as a ... attack. If you look at the second major bullet point on the screen there, variation is to use URL encoding to obscure the characters, ... and or backslash, right? Either way, but typically you see it as /. That is a directory traversal or ... attack. The dots indicate the number of directories that we're going to move. The line says, hey, go to this particular directory, stop, go 2 more directories, stop, and then we're going to be able to go ahead and we're going to be able to drill down, let's say, in that area. That tells us or tells the bad actor and allows the bad actor to tell the system who's processing it how far they want to go, how many directories do they want to walk through, where is that information. And if we are able to push that attack through, it is because directory browsing has been enabled and is not controlled or disabled on that web server. And this is really the heart of this issue. So configuring the web server to only retrieve files with pre-configured file extensions and blocking traversal sequences like ... dashes or ... forward or backslash can actually be a protective measure that works here. But, there's some ways we get around this, right? We can encode this particular ... dash attack by using URL encoded equivalents to make it less obvious in the string. So instead of seeing something that's ... dash ... slash, I should say, or / backslash, the idea there is we can use %, the number 2, the letter E is in echo, to represent the period in that syntax, and then the % number 2 and letter F as in Frank or Falco or Foxtrot, whatever you prefer. I just have Falco going around in my head for some reason. But whatever it is, When we use %2f, that represents the forward or the backslash. And as a result of that, we could easily replace that syntax in a URL that seemingly looks normal, because we've all seen URLs that have percents and alphanumeric characters in them, because %20, for instance, represents a space in a URL string. So we're used to seeing those encoding solutions and don't really think twice about them. Well, if the system interprets them and we don't catch them by filtering or verifying input, they're going to pass through, and that directory traversal attack may still be possible. So we have to examine those URLs closely, but we can actually bypass a lot of that filtering that may go on as well. Look at the very bottom point on the screen here. We can also bypass that server block for traversal filtering by using what's known as the URL encoded character, the null byte, %00, which essentially, when it happens in the string, tells the application, in this case the web server, stop reading and proceed, meaning anything that happens after that should be ignored. Just execute the command that I've just asked you to carry out. So we may have a bunch of other stuff going on beyond that, but it is now essentially commented out. And so as a result, there's a lot of ways for us to understand this attack, but also a lot of subtlety associated with the different ways ways in which is what I was trying to say, it may actually occur. Let's check in with Chris real quick. Let's see what he has to say about all this before we continue on talking about some more web application attack vectors. So Chris, some thoughts about this?
Yeah. Well, I know that directory traversal is pretty bad, Adam, but the Rock Me Amadeus attack that is now running through my head, thank you so much for the Falco reference. And of course, even we are online with our on-air forum, and they are also commenting. So it's always good when Adam brings up earworms that will be in your head forever and ever. But all kidding aside, besides the Falco reference, what do we need to know about web application attacks besides directory traversal? I'm thinking some cross-site scripting and other things, correct, Adam?
So definitely cross-site scripting, what we commonly refer to as XSS attacks, and cross-site request forgeries, CSRF attacks. These are going to be big. They're always on everybody's web application vulnerability list, and certainly things we want to be on the lookout for. Join me here. Let's break them down real quick, talk about them. There are some similarities, but also some important differences. People often confuse them and say they're very similar, perhaps get the confusion wrapped around which particular type of attack has the hallmark that identifies it and gets those cross-wired, and as a result gets them backwards. Things we want to know: there are different types or flavors of cross-site scripting, so reflected, stored, and DOM. So I want to make sure we're aware of that. There's some good guidance on all that down there at that URL from OWASP. But cross-site scripting attacks overall, the idea behind it is that the attacker, the bad actor, is able to get us to execute malicious code inside of our browser. That by itself is going to be the same with cross-site request forgery, by the way. So those two attacks do start out the same. The goal is to execute malicious code via the browser. But the difference here is that the code is usually injected by the attacker when the browser visits a trusted site. So the browser is directed there, however it gets there. And when it goes to that site, we're then able to take over and inject code, which of course hijacks essentially the browser and gets it to do things it would not normally do. Things like harvesting of credentials, redirecting the victim to a bad site where we can then install additional malware and take over the machine and do all sorts of stuff, maybe hijack a user session. All those things and more can be the outcome of a cross-site scripting attack. One of the most common attacks we see propagated across the web. The only thing that's more popular these days than this is injection attacks. And the combination of the two is devastating. So you want to make sure you're aware of that. I would spend a moment, if I was you, understanding the subtle but important flavoring differences of the types of XSS. Reflected really deals with the way in which applications or APIs that are going to be using and accepting input, and we've been talking about this for some time now, when they're accepting user input that is not validated in any way. Hey, we talk to strangers. What could be wrong with that? When we accept that input as part of the coming and going, the transmission of data, well, that's going to be an issue because the user will obviously have the potential to be interacting with malicious content. And that, of course, can point them to an attacker-controlled area where the system can be compromised. So this is what we would think of as reflected XSS. Stored XSS, which is the most dangerous of the three types of cross-site scripting, by the way. the application or API stores this unsanitized, unvalidated user input, and it's viewed at a later time by another user, meaning often the comment fields on websites are going to be used to propagate this attack. Information can be put there that when it is viewed or becomes available to other users as they stop by at some point throughout the history and the use of that site over time is then able to essentially propagate and reignite that attack, renewing it against everybody who either accesses that information or in some way comes into contact with it. So hiding in plain sight in many respects, but because it is there and just archived and available, is able to reactivate and attach to new systems in an ongoing way. Very devastating, as I suggested, the most serious of the cross-site scripting attacks because of its longevity and its ability to propagate itself almost in an infinite way, right, until somebody realizes that content is bad and removes it. And then the DOM attack, right, the DOM XSS attack, things that are going to include, right, dynamically include data, can be manipulated by bad actors and attackers to include data that they control. And so as a result of that, manipulating the object model and being able to include this dynamic data will then also allow us to overtake and potentially manipulate boxes and have bad outcomes. So we want to be on the lookout for all of this, but very important, keep in mind that, and I'm going to do a comparison for you as soon as we get done talking about cross-site request forgery that brings the two together in some really good basic ways for you. But keep in mind, this is a significant vulnerability. We want to make sure we're comfortable with addressing it and understand the do's and don'ts here. So let's talk about cross-site request forgeries as well. CSRF, again, right, very similar in some respects, right? The vector that is used to compromise the system ultimately winds up being, right, delivered over the web, typically through the web browser. And as a result of that is the focus of these attacks, but we diverge from cross-site scripting attacks when we talk about cross-site request forgery. Here, the victim is tricked into submitting some sort of request that is malicious. So maybe they click on a link, something happens, and the idea is the bad actor is able to take over and inherit the identity and privilege of that user that's already logged in. So one of the first things we notice that's different here is that cross-site request forgeries require the user to be logged on with an active session that can be taken over by the bad actor, turn to their advantage and allow them to execute things that the user would be able to do, or perhaps through that user context is then elevated to do, but is clearly things the user would not normally do. Whereas the cross-site scripting attack doesn't require a user to be logged in. We're not taking over your identity. We're simply taking over your browser, and as a result of that, manipulating and using the software to get up to no good. So this is a major fundamental difference between the two, one you want to be on the lookout for in just a minute as we summarize. So please keep that in mind, but it is important for us to understand that once the user is logged in, if the bad actor is able to essentially assume that identity, the browser requests automatically will have things like credentials associated with that site, user session cookie, their IP address, etc. If they're able to trick that user into clicking on that link and then gain control of that session through the browser, well, that user is authenticated to the site. Site has no way of knowing that the information that's now being sent by the bad actor is in any way not legitimate because the user appears to continuously be normal, authenticated, and therefore trustworthy. And the information exchange is going on as if it is still legitimate, when in fact, it's actually been taken over by the bad actor. So this is one of the key hallmarks of this attack and something you want to focus on. I mentioned a summary. Let's quickly put that up on screen for you. Some good points of reference here to help you distinguish between the two for purposes of the exam. Primary difference here is that the CSRF attack requires, as I suggested, an authenticated session, whereas the XSS attack does not. That's really important. Make sure you pick up on that. CSRF is restricted to only actions that the victim can perform within that session based on their identity. In other words, remember, essentially we're impersonating, right, and taking over that user session. So we're limited to what that user would normally be able to do. Whereas cross-site scripting, XSS, works on the execution of malicious scripts, potentially broadening the scope of what the attacker is able to do as they execute inside that system. So can be more devastating because it may have more reach and therefore more applicability to system data and other areas of the system that we may not normally get to as an authorized user using a CSRF approach. And then XSS, the cross-site scripting, requires a vulnerability to already exist. So in other words, there has to be something the user, that actor, can use to gain advantage, whereas CSRF remember, relies on tricking the user. It's essentially social engineering, right, to get them to click on a link to then have that browser be compromised because we are able to redirect them somewhere where we can control them. So one is requiring a pre-existing vulnerable condition that we can leverage. The other requires tricking the user through social engineering to essentially open the door, right, and let us in. And CSRF can only send requests but cannot view the response. This is part of the limiting factor of the cross-site request forgery attack, whereas cross-site scripting attacks are able to send and receive data, and as a result of that, understand and extract information from that entire communication chain, makes them more devastating because the scope, again, can be widened and can be more significant. So let's check in with Chris. Done a good job, hopefully, of tearing down, comparing, contrasting here between cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgeries. Some significant real estate we want to make sure we're comfortable understanding here when it comes to web application attacks.
Yeah, I have to admit that, one of the things that when I look at these two, that sometimes I think one is the other or the other one's the different one. And so a really good list here, Adam, that we just had, and definitely, might be something they might want to trip you up on when you are taking that CAS 004. Okay, so we talked about web application attacks. Something else that most people have probably either heard of or might be familiar with are, of course, our injection attacks. So things like you got your SQL injection, LDAP injection, things like that.
So we do, and absolutely, and you and I have talked about these in some other episodes. So this is, in as many respects, a review as it is a first-time experience, depending on what order you may be watching these episodes in. Join me on screen. Injection attacks, very prevalent, as I suggested, really up at the top of everybody's web application vulnerability list in most cases, and if not at the top, very near the top. These are trailing off a little bit in priority and focus recently, but are still very problematic. There are all sorts of different injection attack types, as you can see: XML and XML external entity, XXE injections, LDAP, lightweight directory access protocol injections, command, as well as process injections, and of course, SQL injections, as I've talked about already. And we talked about some of this in our prior episodes in this topic block. I even talked about authentication bypass, which is going to come up on the next screen in just a moment. As part of this, I'll look at the bolded SQL or structured query language query statement on the screen in front of you. This is something you need to be familiar with, know how to read. Now, I'm not suggesting, let me be clear, that you need to become an expert in SQL queries in order to take and pass this exam. Far from it. What I am suggesting is you should be able to recognize an SQL query syntax statement. You should be able to look at it, break it down, and say, oh, that is an example of an injection attack. It's an SQL injection, and here is why, right? The select, the from, and the username, all capitals along with or, and the and password, right? Those are going to be command statements, or in the case of or and, they are Boolean operators joining command statements together, and or they are declared items that we are looking to set a value for, right? So password is equal to PW, username is equal to something. But select and from are basically just commands we're actually asking SQL, the structured query language, to execute as part of the query. Now, what we're doing here is the select asterisk means select everything, select all, right? From where? From a table called user table, where that username, so in this case, username, is going to be, and then it says space equals, and then it says quote, right? Or, and then it says small letter x in single quotes equal to small letter x in single quotes. Now, as I break down, what that means is that username, which is going to be a item that is declared in the user table. It is going to be one of two. Username and password are both typically declared there as values that we want to be able to assign iteratively as we create entries in that table. Every user will have a username and a password assigned to them, for instance. When we say username equal to essentially a space, right, with just a double quote, that means where the username is blank or there is no username. And or x equals x. Well, x is always equal to x. That evaluates as true every time. You often also see this as 1 equals 1. And when you see 1 equals 1, that is always a true statement. What happens then is that SQL interprets that and says, oh, username's blank and or always evaluate to true. Well, I can return those, but that's all I want. So what do? I put the 2 dashes there. And the 2 dashes is a comment indicator in SQL, meaning we ignore everything at the end of that line beyond the 2 dashes. I am going to return back the information on the user stored in that table, because I'm going to stop processing at the end of the 2 X's before the double dash. Or, as I suggested when we talked about authentication bypass, I will be authenticated as the first user stored in that table, which is, as I suggested, more often than not, the administrator of that system. And so as a result, manipulation, just a little bit of very standardized, structured SQL language allows us to be able to manipulate it to the bad actor's favor and dump the entire contents of, in this case, the user table. So this is what a SQL injection is likely to look like. Protection against this is very straightforward. Don't allow dynamic queries to be inserted into a web form and processed by the backend system, the database, because bad actors type these queries in and submit them in the forms, as I've already suggested. Instead, have hard-coded static queries that can only be processed and executed from within the system, not from outside being processed because we're getting them dynamically, but processed because they exist and we're only allowing them because we know what they are. This is the #1 way we protect against these attacks. So please keep that in mind. Authentication bypass allows us to do exactly what I described. Again, we're using a statement like or x equals x or 1 equals 1. These translate out and are ultimately evaluated out as true. And we then typically are authenticated as the administrative user. I mentioned input validation as being one of the key ways to do this. Parameterization is also a very good way to protect against this. Username and password fields are passed as variables and processed as text strings instead of actual values that, as a result, the bad actor can manipulate. When taken together, this is what we want to be thinking about with injection attacks. Very important for us to be focused on this, but also to be aware of the concerns associated with how this can essentially dump our user data in uncontrolled ways. Chris, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as we take a look at it, some of these are going to be things you need to look at and recognize, perhaps out of a string of code or instructions that are put in front of you. Always good to look for that. And, you know, as Adam said, a lot of these things we've heard the terms, you know, LDAP injection or SQL injection. What does that really mean? Now, the next thing, though, that we want to take a look at is something near and dear to my heart a little bit back in the day when I was doing a lot more installing of infrastructure, especially in the world of Cisco and networking, and that is VLAN hopping, which of course is one of those things, those little nefarious things that comes out there. And I remember just kind of making it a mantra to all of my students of saying, you know, you always change the default VLAN ID and you don't use dynamic trunking and certain things that we want to use to perhaps stop that, right, Adam?
Absolutely. So VLAN hopping, big issue, especially not only in physical infrastructure racked and stacked in an on-premises environment, but in the cloud today, in our virtualized environments, and certainly in our software-defined data centers. Join me here, if you will. Let's quickly hit the highlights on this. So VLAN hopping, really 2 issues here: switch spoofing and or double tagging. Notice I've given you protection statements on both. Important to identify the attack vector, but also know how to mitigate it. When we are dealing with switch spoofing, we're able to transmit traffic to the switch to identify and make it appear as if it's originating from another switch as opposed to an endpoint device. In other words, we are literally spoofing and impersonating a switch that should be trusted. A switch that is vulnerable to this kind of an attack automatically configures that inbound connection as a port that is trunked, as Chris was just suggesting. And as a result of that, all the VLAN traffic across that entire switch will now be compromised and visible through that trunked port. And we could then simply scoop it up and we can work with it, but we can also interact with those machines in those VLANs, potentially misdirecting them and even taking them over. So here we need to make sure that we change that default configuration. Do not allow the use of dynamic trunking. Trunk ports that must be defined should be explicitly defined and configured manually by a network administrator and or through scripts that are automating that, but should be done under our control, not dynamically at the discretion of the switch, in other words, is what we would suggest. And also double tagging. An adversary is going to take advantage, again, of default configurations of the native VLAN. That VLAN ID is traditionally 1, and we manipulate the tags that are associated with traffic that should be bound to and available through that. And as a result, if we don't do anything here, the default VLAN ID being left at 1 and not changed, will mean that we are able to snoop and ultimately interact with that traffic and potentially redirect it and perhaps interact with it in ways that it was not designed for us to do. So real important there. I want to be thinking about that. In addition, I want to make sure we know about BGP, Border Gateway Protocol, and route hijacking. This occurs fairly often, once, twice, maybe 3 times a year. We have some sort of BGP route hijacking issue on the internet. DNS goes crazy. We're unable to find things. Somebody gets the bright idea of propagating one or more announcements made by an autonomous system, the AS at the end of that bullet statement there. And as a result of that, because we inherently, according to how BGP operates, inherently trust those announcements coming from those autonomous systems that are identified by ASNs, autonomous system numbers, we essentially say, oh yeah, you're broadcasting a route telling me it's good. Well, I trust that. I'll propagate that. Well, if we allow that to go unchallenged and we allow those propagation statements, or rather the trust statements to be propagated, then what happens is our routes go from maybe something like this to now this, right? And we go all over the place and have all sorts of crazy outcomes because traffic goes off higgly-piggly here and there. So IP prefix filtering, which enables us to ensure that those announcements are sent and accepted only from well-defined autonomous systems that are trusted, is the best way to prevent this. In other words, let's have essentially a list of trusted sources and let's ignore strangers. This is like an ongoing theme that we keep coming back to. Do not talk to strangers. Do not accept information from them. And this is, again, the way in which we would likely protect against this. And finally, a hit list of just some things that are odds and ends, but things you certainly want to be aware of. Sandbox escape. How do we get out of confined environments? Virtual machine hopping and escape. Anything that has to do with escape is the idea of we're in an area well-defined. We're not supposed to go beyond that border. All of a sudden, we find one or more exit points, and we are able to. Escaping containment implies that we can then access system resources we're not supposed to see. Interception attacks, how do we interpret data that's not meant for us? DOS, DDoS, denial of service, distributed denial of service, one or a group of people beating up on a single point, trying to prevent access through denying the use of that resource. And we've mentioned the importance of social engineering already, tricking people into doing things that normally they would not do. Cross-site request forgery, right, might be a good example of that. So we talked about all these. And Chris, that in a nutshell, is probably what we want to think of with regards to infrastructure attacks.
Fantastic stuff, Adam. Thank you so much. And for all of you joining us, we have more exciting episodes still to come, chock full of amazing goodness to prepare you for that CAS Plus exam. So join us each and every episode. Very important. Don't forget to download those materials if you haven't already done so. And we'll see you in our next episode soon, right here at IT Pro TV.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.
Here on CAS Plus, we've been talking a lot about how bad actors can be deceptive and they can go out and try to gain information about us and use it against us. But guess what? We can be deceptive as well. Join us for this episode as we take a look at what we can do to be deceptive.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm Chris Ward, joined by Adam Gordon, and we are continuing CAS Plus, preparing you for that CAS 004 exam. And I got to tell you, today is a fun day because, like I said in the teaser, it seems like the bad actors are always the ones that get to try to fool you a little bit. And in this episode, Adam, we're going to actually talk about some of those deceptive ways that we can trick them. Things like honeypots and honey nets and all kinds of cool things.
So we are going to talk about a lot of different things. We generically, probably high level, group them together under the moniker of deceptive technologies. We'll begin our conversations there. But there's a lot of different approaches, not just deceptive technologies that we use, although those are always very helpful. It is from, I should say, the defense perspective, right? So thinking about a blue team perspective for just a moment, it's incredibly helpful for a security practitioner to be able to observe the approaches, the techniques, the ways in which a bad actor, an adversary, may attempt to come at us and look for weaknesses, vulnerabilities that they can exploit. And if we can understand those methodologies, or at least have a good sense of the types and the logic of the approach, the attack that may be used, it is easier for us to prepare and to do so proactively. So being able to observe the attacker in their native environment through deceptive technologies is a really good defensive and beneficial solution for us to consider. Join me here on screen, if you will. Let's take a look at some of the things that make up this area. Certainly the use of honeypots and honey nets, as Chris was suggesting, are going to be very helpful and important. If you're not familiar with them, got a little definition going on there. Remember, a honey net is really just the aggregation of several honeypots together, networked in such a way that they appear to actually form a network to the bad actor. A honeypot is an individual system configured and set up in such a way that it is temptingly going to be susceptible. There are vulnerabilities that are there, but non-obvious ones that would make them stand out. Hey, we're running Windows 7 with no security patches, right? That's probably not going to be as attractive to somebody compared to, let's say, a current version of Debian or Ubuntu or SUSE or perhaps Windows Server 2019, 2022 that is patched but may not have every patch and every vulnerability currently assessed and known addressed. They may have to work at it to get in, but the likelihood is give that a public IP address and leave it dangling out there long enough, you'll find several people that are willing to try to attack that, and then we'll give you the evidence that you may be looking for. We may use decoy files, honey tokens, and or what are commonly called canary traps. This is a file or are files that would have data that on the surface seems appealing, right? So it seems like it would be sensitive data, right? We're always focused on, always talking about the issues associated with confidentiality, the exposure of data to bad actors that are not authorized to see it, as well as integrity concerns, modification of data without knowledge and consent of the owner. And so decoy files are meant to tempt those bad actors into tipping their hand around one or both of these activities. But of course, the data is fake. It's not real. It may approximate real data, may be meant to look like real data, may have the structure, the format, but it is just non-real data. It's made up or fake. And so we want to make sure we're aware of that. And then we, of course, can use those to, again, genuinely observe and understand the approach, the attempt itself. Why is it happening? What kind of data may be valuable, be seen as valuable? What is attractive, in other words, right, to those bad actors? What kind of information would lure them out? And then what kind of approaches are they using? But along with decoy files, honeypots, and honey nets, we also want to be thinking about the use of and the value of things like simulators, right? And the ability to be able to go in and to run a simulation, not the same thing as essentially a live environment than a honeypot or a honey net, with the use of potentially decoy files may actually provide. This is less complicated to deploy. It is something that is self-contained. It could be used by one or perhaps a small group, even a team of individuals, but can be used in a safe alternative space and doesn't require connection to the real world, and also doesn't require, therefore, the addition of bad actors that are actively attacking and trying to gain advantage against that system. So as a result, it's going to be a very valuable additional tool in the toolbox. But we also want to think about the use of network configurations. How can dynamic network configurations, the use of being able to integrate detection as well as software-defined capabilities to allow us to better understand what's happening on our networks, pair that with continuous monitoring, and of course, baselining and hardening. It allows us to say, hey, under normal conditions, right, this is what our network should look like. And oh, by the way, it should always stay within these parameters when things change, when we see anomalous, suspicious, and or aberrant behavior, bad traffic, in other words, right, things coming in from unknown endpoints that are not registered, things coming in that are using unusual protocols, traffic going out that is going to unknown destinations using unusual protocols at unusual times or in unusual amounts. Any and all these things are indicators of compromise, IOCs that Chris and I have talked about in other areas of the course. So make sure you're thinking about the fact that if we're monitoring and we're able to understand that, we can use that to our advantage. We can reassess and maybe realign our networks dynamically through software definition and, of course, through automation. And we may be able to automatically deploy, modify, upgrade, change, or redeploy those configurations when an attack is underway to change the trajectory of that attack and to perhaps take the advantage back. So any and all these things, Chris, would fall into the deceptive technologies bucket. as we begin our conversations. Definitely some things to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And I like how in this last portion we talked about, with the dynamic network configurations about how we definitely want to adjust and pivot when something comes in and something's attacking us. But we also perhaps want to snare them a little bit. So that way we can do what we're going to talk about next, which is maybe do some data analytics where we can now gather a little bit more of that information that they think that they're reaching out and getting stuff, but we're actually gaining some information from them, and we can use things like the processing pipelines, some other things that we see here with security data analytics, correct?
So we can, and the idea behind, as I trip over my tongue, the idea behind security data analytics is, as you can see on the screen, really this combination, right, of all the tools, as Chris was suggesting and describing it, along with the information that we're actually gathering and the analysis we can do. All of that together is really going to form this idea of security data analytics. Generically, right? Analytics of any kind involves using some sort of tool set, the ability to collect the items that are going to be analyzed, and then of course the items themselves, right? And bringing all that together in some organized, structured, formal way with defined ways that we could then communicate findings is all going to be important. When we put the words security and or data in front of analytics, well, we're narrowing that field, right? Now we're talking about specifically data and analyzing data of one or more types. And we put the word security there. We're focusing on the security implications of that data to our organization. And so we're looking at things like threat detection, incident awareness. We're looking at the ability to be able to drive decisions and understand how things are unfolding in either real time or near real time by using these systems and these techniques. Chris mentioned the processing pipeline as well. These are the software elements that allow us to automate the collection, extraction, validation, ultimately the transformation of that data that we're talking about gathering and analyzing, and to do so with the addition of visualization. Today, more and more, our data streams are so complicated, so complex, so rich in various forms of information that it's really unrealistic for a human, perhaps even a group of humans, to look at that data in even anything like real time or near real time, or even historically, to be able to delve into that data with unlimited amounts of time and understand and derive the kinds of value and meaning that are there, because a lot of the patterns, a lot of the information is non-obvious, and we need advanced analytics and advanced intelligence engines to be able to examine that data and bring that information to the surface. Well, this gets into the idea of using machine learning, artificial intelligence, things of that nature, but the processing pipeline allows that to happen at scale and brings those capabilities for us to the fore. Things that are really going to be important here, want to differentiate between the different types of data that we will likely see. Static versus stream data. Think of stream as being dynamic. It's coming in real time or near real time. Maybe it's coming through a feed that is being aggregated through a SIEM solution. And static data is going to be logs, reports, information that is going to sit in one or more systems that's recorded, but we're not actually bringing it into a system and then aggregating and analyzing it as it's coming in. We're going and gathering it if and when we have an issue. As I mentioned, things like forensics and investigations would tend to rely on static data. So when we're thinking about processing pipelines, we just want to understand we can work with different types of data, and it is important to note that. In addition, we want to focus on things like indexing, searching. These are the bread and butter activities of the statistical analysis that goes on, and ultimately the security data analysis that takes place is really about understanding the kind of information we have. Indexing helps us to tell that story in meaningful ways. We can then allow that information to become usable through searching. Indexing is the secret that allows us to say we've got this big, huge amount of undefined information. Let's figure out how to identify important elements. Let's then organize our data in ways that is going to be allowing it to be accessible for searching. And then searching is the act of actually going in and looking for and hopefully finding, if all goes well, both patterns that are obvious and, as I mentioned, non-obvious patterns that may be hidden. Searching is often done through one or more querying engines. There's a variety of query languages. For Chris and I talk about SQL, structured query language. There are a variety of different ones that may be used, but whatever the language is, however we ask the questions, The point is, if we don't index the data, there's no way for us to do so in any way approaching meaningfulness, because we have a huge amount of undefined, really unstructured information, and there's no standardization that allows us to search across it. So think about indexing as being the ability to organize our data to then understand the meaning of it we search. And finally, database activity monitoring, what's commonly referred to as DAM. This is going to be focused on the identification of changes. So think of it as essentially a tripwire system, but tripwire system focused on, as the name implies, activity in one or more databases. So we're looking at the DBMS, the database management system, and we're attempting to understand through, again, near real-time and real-time monitoring of the tables, of the data, of the traffic flow, of the access, of all the variables that go into using a database. We're looking at information and trying to understand what's happening so that we can be identifying or potentially be alerted to incidents and or activity in one form or another that is perhaps non-exceptional, perhaps normal, although it may be occurring at abnormal times, or perhaps it is exceptional and it is abnormal, even though it is occurring during normal times, right? So it's not just about, hey, it's during business hours and you're accessing this data. It's about the fact that during business hours, data is being accessed that is in deep archive, deep storage that normally should not be. Or we're accessing data at times from systems with credentials in ways that does not normally occur. Any and all of these things would trip, hopefully, one or more alerts and require investigation and maybe even automated responses through a database activity monitoring solution. So, Chris, as we think about security data analytics, these are the kinds of structures, kinds of systems, kinds of activities that help us to frame this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And, interestingly enough, when we talk about information security management, if somebody's doing something like in the world of ITIL, you'll notice that we talk about the PDC, right? The preventative, detection, and then correction that occurs. And several of the things that Adam's been talking about so far, some really cool little tools and ways to look at things once you've detected. Adam, what about the preventative side of things? What are some of the preventative controls, and what do we need to know about those for the exam?
So when we think about preventative controls, right, what we're talking about ultimately are going to be things, and there's a small list on the screen. These are not by any means the only ones that exist. There are many, many of them, but just a small sampling. But ideas here are going to be around things that can be put in place and that are going to allow us, number one, to have some sort of, hopefully, automation associated with the process of monitoring and looking at trying to mitigate risk. Remember, the idea of a control, a safeguard, a countermeasure, these are all synonymous with one another. They all mean the same thing. Control, safeguards, countermeasures, their primary goal is to mitigate risk, to attach to it and address it in one or more ways. And so when we think about the identification of risk and then the mitigation, the minimization of it, to minimize impact, perhaps even zero it out, if we can do that, we want systems that are always going to be available, always doing their job, but we also want to be able to automate those if at all possible, because the reality is we're not going to stand guard 24/7, 365 individually, collectively as humans. We can in some circumstances, but that ability to focus is going to be limited, and the resources required to make that effort consistent and viable are immense. And so the more we can automate and turn over to systems that we only have to check in with when there's an issue, 23 hours, 59 minutes out of a day, we might be able to ignore them because they're on guard doing their thing on their own. And when there are a few alerts, we then are told and we pay attention. Checking in as opposed to continuously monitoring ourselves is the theme here. Preventative controls will allow us, hopefully, if they're set up the right way, that flexibility. But the preventative control type is really a type of control that's focused on attempting, if at all possible, to make bad actions on the part of a bad actor unrealistic for them to affect us. Meaning, we would like to deter, if at all possible, as another control type. I'd like to be able to put up a sign that says, hey, bad dog, don't come on my property, right? That, if you're walking by, may be enough to dissuade you and say, well, I'm not going to go up and knock on that door. I don't want to get bit by a dog. But if you don't take on the sign, you're not deterred. You still make the choice to engage. The preventative control would be that I actually let the bad dog run in the yard and it bites you right before you come on my porch. So the preventative control should be significant enough that it's going to impact the bad actor and really deflect and hopefully minimize and even at the end of the day prevent those activities that they're trying to engage in. And so these controls speak to that. Antivirus is going to be running in the background on an endpoint. If malware is introduced or through some sort of socially engineered or phishing-like activities, we are tempted to click on a link that may try to take over the system and introduce those elements that lead to compromise. Hopefully the AV engine will be able to pick that up and either short circuit that or perhaps stop it through quarantining or a variety of approaches. Things like immutable systems where we have a hard-coded changeable solution. No, we have a hard-coded unchangeable solution, right? You got to read carefully. Make sure you pick up on that because I find when I talk to people a lot about immutability that they think it means that we're actually able to make changes. Yes, in theory, we can make changes, but only under very tightly controlled conditions. The goal of immutability is to create a system architecture that is hard-coded and unchangeable. It is locked down and as a result is hardened so that it's unlikely to be compromised. And hardening is, of course, part of that, as well as sandbox detonation. This idea of running and accessing questionable files or files that may lead to compromise, even if they're not questionable normally, and activities like going out to websites do that in a sandbox, a virtual environment where if for some reason we access something that does wind up blowing up on us, we can contain it and really just destroy the memory space, removing potentially any likelihood that that activity can get beyond that particular boundary. So the idea of sandbox detonation is really this idea of running in almost like a Java virtual machine, right? A protected memory space, although it's more advanced than what we would have thought of as a JVM years ago. And by protecting that space, we control what goes on inside of it, only allowing that boundary to be crossed by authorized activity, both inbound and outbound, by the way, right? Just to make sure we're clear on that. So Chris, preventative controls, lots of different things, but ultimately we're talking about a sampling here that are going to try to stop bad actions from occurring, even though they may initially take hold.
Yeah, and as always, Adam, we've been telling everybody that, hey, you have your list, your downloadables. There's a reason why we point out certain things. If Adam has it up on the slide and he's linking down through that, it's probably a good idea for you to be aware of those and understand, what they're used for, how they might be used. So we talk a lot about systems and we talk a lot about, services and things that we have. But one of the biggest targets, Adam, is, of course, applications. And so what do we need to know about application controls that we can use?
So when we think about application controls, what we're thinking about, again, not an exhaustive list, but just certainly a sampling, things that go into and operate around controls that will, again, control in one way or another, prevent, if at all possible, mitigate, minimize the kinds of activities that can lead to compromise. Allow versus block lists, for instance, right? So saying that this activity from this person, from this IP in this area may or may not be good. Licensing, enforcing licensing requirements that only authorized official licensed software and components can be loaded and used. We've already talked about, Chris and I, time of check, time of use, talk to, and issues associated with that in prior episodes. And the idea of atomic execution, the capability for a task to run with exclusive lock or access to resources. We actually did talk as part of time of check, time of use about
Sorry about that. Back to it in a sec.
And in fact, just to say the word atomic execution is just kind of fun to say anyway. All right, to kind of wrap this up, a couple other things that we probably need to discuss. First off, what about the operating system? And then something that I think a lot of people ignore is physical security controls. What are some things that we need to know for CAS Plus for that?
So, Chris, when we think about operating systems, we probably want to come at this from the perspective of operating system scheduling, right? The ability to look at automation from a security standpoint around the OS is really built around the idea of how we control the setting up, the running, the oversight of tasks. And in Linux, it would be the cron function. In Windows, they are scheduled tasks. These can be used, these features and these capabilities, to trigger scripts, right? So the use of automated technology in one form or another gives us advantage, but obviously we want to know we can use it to manipulate on a local level, an individual system. Scripts can be powerful. They can do a lot of things. And obviously in the right hands, they are very, very good. In the wrong hands, well, bad actors can, of course, take over this system and potentially use it against us, running scripts that reinstall malware, perhaps undo changes that antivirus and or firewall configuration has done. So automated responses can, in other words, be zeroed out and rolled back through scripts, and persistence can be achieved in the box. So we do have to be aware of that and just think about the logic of operating system schedulers. We often find, as we do forensic examination on boxes that have been compromised, that there are one or more scripts that are buried somewhere in the subsystem running that allow that system to be persisted and maintained in the hands of the bad actors. So that is something to think about and just something to consider. But you're right, Chris. Also, the overlooked or often overlooked area of physical security controls is something we should at least tip our hat to and acknowledge as we get ready to finish up this particular episode. You can see a list of some things that we would often throw out as being good examples of physical security controls: lighting in dark spaces to enable clear and unobstructed observing, so we can both record and actually physically observe in real time; the use of cameras to do so in remote and areas where automation and the lack of human presence may be a consideration; issues with closed, confined spaces where we want to clearly understand who is coming and going, and the use of closed circuit TV, CCTV, as well as perhaps guards that are going to be present at key choke points, and signage that will remind people that they are, even though seemingly physically not being observed and perhaps alone, that visually there is something and someone watching. Open spaces have to be considered. How do we address large open spaces like the entrances and the exits of buildings? Are we observing there with physical as well as automated systems, guards, guns, gates, and closed circuit TV? And as I mentioned, visitors to facilities have to be addressed as well. The idea here is that we want to make sure people understand that there is always something or someone on guard, and they should act and conduct themselves accordingly. We go back to that idea, Chris, of the deterrent and the preventative control conversation. Making people aware so they can make good choices is deterrence. Enforcing actions that minimize risk if they make bad choices is prevention. I want to make sure we understand the difference between the two.
Excellent episode that we have here. And of course, we took a look at things like deceptive technologies that we can use to help capture those bad actors. We also took a look at security data analytics, many more things here in this episode of CAS Plus. Join us. We're going to continue on. We got more exciting episodes here to help prepare you for that CAS 004 exam.